Proceeding further, he found also a pen made of planks with a dozen animals scratching inside it, belonging, he decided, to the poultry species, even though at home he had never seen any with such plumage. They too seemed hungry, but the hens had laid, and were glorifying the event like their sisters all over the world, 6 eggs. Roberto seized one immediately, pierced it with the tip of his knife, and sucked it as he had done as a child. Then he placed the others inside his shirt and, to compensate the fecund mothers and fathers who were staring at him with great outrage, shaking their wattles, he distributed water and food, and he then did the same, cage by cage, wondering by what providence he had landed on the Daphne just as the animals were about to starve. In fact, by now he had been on the ship 2 nights, so someone had tended the aviaries the day before his arrival at the latest. He felt like a guest who arrives at a feast, tardy, to be sure, but while the last of the other guests are just leaving and the tables have not yet been cleared. For that matter, he said to himself, it is an established fact that someone was here earlier and now is here no longer. Whether it was 1 day or 10 days before my arrival, my fate remains unchanged, or, at most, it becomes more of a mockery. Being shipwrecked a day earlier, I could have joined the sailors of the Daphne, wherever they have gone. Or perhaps not, I could have died with them, if they are dead. He heaved a sigh, at least it had nothing to do with rats, and concluded that he had at his disposal also some chickens. He reconsidered his thought of freeing the bipeds of nobler lineage and decided that if his exile were to last long, they might even prove edible. The hidalgos before Kausali were beautiful and varicolored, too, and yet we fired on them, and if the siege had lasted, we would even have eaten them. Anyone who soldiered in the 30 Years' War, that is what I call it, but those alive at the time did not call it that, and perhaps they did not even understand that it was one long war in the course of which, every now and then, somebody signed a peace treaty, learned how to harden his heart. Chapter 4. Fortification displayed. Why does Roberto evoke Kausali when describing his first days on the ship? His taste for parallels is one reason, of course, besieged then, besieged now. But from a man of his century we demand something better. If anything, what should have fascinated him in the similarity or the differences, fertile in elaborate antitheses? Kausali he had entered of his own choice, to prevent others from entering, he had been cast up on the Daphne, and yearned only to leave it. But I would say, rather, that while he lived a life of shadows, he recalled a story of violent deeds performed in broad daylight, so that the sun-filled days of the siege, which his memory restored to him, would compensate for this dim roaming. And perhaps there was something more to it. In the first part of Roberto's life, there had been only 2 periods in which he learned something of the world and of the ways of inhabiting it. I refer to the few months of the siege and to the later years in Paris. Now he was going through his 3rd formative period, perhaps the last, at the end of which maturity might coincide with dissolution, and he was trying to decipher its secret message, seeing the past as a figure of the present. Kausali, at the beginning, was a story of sorties. Roberto tells this story to the lady, transfiguring it, as if to say that, unable as he had been to storm the castle for intact snow, shaken but not undone by the flame of his 2 sons, in the flame of that earlier sun he had still been able to pit himself against those who laid siege to his Monferrato citadel. The morning after the men from La Griva arrived, Torres sent some single officers, carbines on their shoulder, to observe what the Neapolitans were installing on the hill conquered the previous day. The officers approached too closely, and shots were exchanged. A young lieutenant of the Pompadour regiment was killed. His comrades carried him back inside the walls, and Roberto saw the first slain man in his life. Torres decided to have his men occupy the hovels he had mentioned the day before. From the bastions it was easy to observe the advance of the 10 musketeers, who at a certain point separated in an attempt to seize the first house, as if with pincers. Cannon fire from the walls passed above their heads and tore the roof off the house. Like a swarm of insects, Spaniards dashed out and fled. The musketeers let them escape, took the house, barricaded themselves inside, and began laying down a harassing fire towards the hill. It seemed advisable to repeat the operation against the other houses. Even from the bastions it was clear that the Neapolitans had begun digging trenches, edging them with fagots and gabions. But these did not circumscribe the hill, they ran towards the plain. Roberto learned that this was how the enemy started constructing mine tunnels. Once these reached the walls, they would be packed, along their final stretch, with kegs of powder. It was thus necessary to prevent the initial digging from reaching a depth sufficient to allow further digging underground, otherwise the enemy from that point on could work under cover. This was the whole game. To anticipate from outside, in the open, the construction of the tunnels, and to dig countermine tunnels of one's own from the other direction, until the relief army arrived and while provisions and ammunition lasted. In a siege there is nothing else to do. Harry the other side, and wait. The following morning, as promised, it was the turn of the outwork. Roberto found himself grasping his caliver in the midst of an unruly bunch of men who back in Loo or Cucaro or Odalingo had never wanted to work. With some surly Corsicans, they were all crammed into boats to cross the Po, after 2 French companies had already touched the other shore. Torres and his staff observed from the right bank, and old Pozo saluted his son before waving him on with one hand, then put his forefinger to his cheekbone and pulled the skin down, as if to say, keep your eyes open. The 3 companies made camp in the outwork. Construction had not been completed, and part of the finished walls had already collapsed. The men spent the day barricading the gaps. The position was well protected by a ditch, beyond which some sentries were posted. When night fell, the sky was so bright that the sentries dozed off, and not even the officers considered an attack possible. But suddenly they heard the charge sounded, and they saw the Spanish light cavalry appear. Roberto had been set by Captain Bassiani behind some bales of straw that patched a fallen part of the outer wall. He had no time to realize what was happening. Each cavalryman had a musketeer behind him and, as they arrived at the ditch, the horses began to follow it, surrounding the post while the musketeers fired, eliminating the few sentries. Then each musketeer jumped from his horse's back, rolling into the ditch. As the horsemen formed a semicircle before the entrance, opening heavy fire and forcing the defenders to seek cover, the musketeers, unharmed, reached the gate and the more vulnerable breaches. The Italian company, which was on guard, had emptied its weapons and then scattered, seized with panic, and they would long be reviled for this. But the French companies could do no better. Between the first attack and the scaling of the walls only a few minutes had passed, and the rest of the men were surprised by the attackers, who were inside the walls before the defenders could even grab their weapons. The enemy, exploiting this surprise, were slaughtering the garrison, and they were so numerous that while some continued felling the defenders still on their feet, others had already begun despoiling the fallen. Roberto, after firing on the musketeers, was reloading painfully, his shoulder sore from the recoil. He was unprepared for the charge of the cavalry. As the charge passed over his head through the breach, a horse's hoofs buried him under the collapsing barricade. It was a stroke of luck. Protected by the fallen bales, he survived the first, murderous impact, and now, glancing from beneath his rick, he saw with horror the enemies finishing off the wounded, hacking at a finger in order to steal a ring, or a whole hand for a bracelet. Captain Bassiani, to compensate for the shame of his men's rout, fought on bravely, but he was surrounded and had to surrender. From the riverbank they saw that the situation was critical, and Colonel Lagrange, who had left the outwork after an inspection and was regaining Casale, wanted to rush to the assistance of the defenders, but he was restrained by his officers, who advised him rather to ask the city for reinforcements. From the right bank more boats set out, while Torres, having been wakened abruptly, now arrived at full tilt. It quickly became clear that the French were routed, and the only thing to do was to lay down some covering fire to help the survivors reach the river. In this confusion old Pozo could be seen impatiently galloping back and forth between the staff and the jetty, seeking Roberto among those who had escaped. When it was almost certain that no more boats were coming, he was heard to utter, "Oh cripes." Then, as a man who knew the whims of the river, making a fool of those who had till then heaved and rowed, he chose a spot opposite one of the sandbars and spurred his horse into the water. Crossing a bar, he was on the other shore without even having made the animal swim, and he dashed like a madman, sword upraised, towards the outwork. As the sky was already growing light, a group of enemy musketeers surrounded him, having no idea who this solitary rider was. The solitary rider rode through them, eliminating at least 5 with unerring downward blows. He encountered 2 cavalrymen, made his horse rear, bent to one side, avoiding a thrust, and suddenly sat erect, swinging his blade in a circle. The first adversary slumped over his saddle with his guts slipping down into his boots as the horse ran off. The second remained with his eyes wide, his fingers seeking one ear which, while still attached to his cheek, was hanging below his chin. Pozo arrived at the outwork. The invaders, busy stripping the last to fall, fugitives shot in the back, had no idea where this man had come from. He entered the compound, calling his son in a loud voice. He swept away another 4 people as he described a circle, jabbing his sword at all the cardinal points. Emerging from the straw, Roberto saw him at a distance and, before recognizing his father, he recognized Pagnafli, his father's mount and his own playmate for years. He stuck 2 fingers into his mouth and let out a whistle the animal knew well, and in fact Pagnafli reared, pricked up his ears, and began carrying the father towards the breach. Pozo saw Roberto and shouted, "What are you doing in a place like that? Mount, you lunatic." And as Roberto sprang onto the horse's back and clung to his father's waist, Pozo said, "God's truth, you're never where you should be." Then, spurring Pagnafli again, he galloped off towards the river. Now some of the looters realized that this man in this place was out of place, and they pointed at him, shouting. An officer wearing a dented cuirass and with 3 soldiers following him tried to block Pozo's path. The old man saw him, started to swerve, then pulled on the reins and cried, "Talk about fate." Roberto looked ahead and realized that this was the Spaniard who had let them pass 3 days before. The officer, too, had recognized his prey, and he advanced, eyes gleaming, sword upraised. Old Pozo rapidly shifted his sword to his left hand, drew his pistol from his belt, and held out his arm, all so quickly that the Spaniard was surprised. In his impetuosity he was now almost facing Pozo, who however did not fire at once. He allowed himself the time to say, "Sorry about the pistol. But you're wearing a breastplate, so I have every right." He pressed the trigger and felled the man with a bullet in his mouth. The soldiers, seeing their leader fall, took flight, and Pozo replaced the pistol, saying, "We'd better go on before they lose their temper." "Move, Pagnafli." In a great cloud of dust they crossed the ground and, amid violent spray, the river, while in the distance some men were still emptying their weapons after them. They reached the right bank, to applause. Torres said, "Très bien fait, mon cher ami," then added, to Roberto, "Lagrive, today all of them ran off, and only you remained." What's bred in the bone? You're wasted in that company of cowards. You will join my staff. Roberto thanked him and then, climbing down from the saddle, held out a hand to his father to thank him. Pozo clasped it absently, saying, I'm sorry for that Spaniard, such a fine gentleman. Well, war's an ugly animal, that's sure. Anyway, my son, never forget. Always be good, but if somebody comes at you and means to kill you, then he's in the wrong. Am I right? They re-entered the city, and Roberto heard his father still muttering to himself, I didn't go looking for him. Chapter 5. The Labyrinth of the World. Roberto recalls that episode, caught up in a moment of filial devotion, daydreaming of a happy time when a protective figure could save him from the confusion of a siege, but he cannot help recalling what happened afterwards. And this does not seem to me a simple accident of memory. I have said before that Roberto apparently connects those distant events with his experiences on the Daphne, as if to find motives, reasons, signs of destiny. Now I would say that harking back, on the ship, to the Kausali days helps him retrace the stages through which, as a youth, he slowly learned that the world was composed of alien architectures. As if, on the one hand, finding himself now suspended between sky and sea could be only the most consequent development of his 3 lustra of peregrinations in a territory made up of forked paths. And, on the other hand, I believe that in reconstructing the history of his misfortunes he was seeking consolation for his present state, as if the shipwreck had restored him to that earthly paradise he had known at La Griva and had left behind on entering the walls of the besieged city. Asterisk. Now Roberto no longer deloused himself in the soldiers' quarters but sat at Taurus's table amid gentlemen from Paris, and he listened to their boasts, their recollections of other campaigns, their fatuous or brilliant talk. In these conversations, beginning on the very first evening, he was given reason to believe that the siege of Kausali was not the enterprise he had thought he was to take part in. He had come here to bring to life his dreams of chivalry, nourished by the poems he had read at La Griva. To come from good stock and to have finally a sword at his side meant becoming a paladin who might cast away his life for word from his king, or for the rescue of a lady. After his arrival, the devout host he had joined proved to be a mob of slothful peasants ready to turn and run at the first sign of a fight. Now he was admitted to an assembly of heroes who welcomed him as one of their own. He knew that his heroism was the result of a misunderstanding. He had stayed in the outwork, all right, but only because he was even more frightened than those who had fled it. And, worse, after Monsieur de Torres retired, and the others stayed up all night gossiping freely, Roberto came to realize that the whole siege was nothing but one more chapter in a meaningless history. True, Don Vincenzo of Mantua had died and left the dukedom to Nevers, but if someone else had been present at the old man's deathbed, the story could have turned out quite differently. For example, Charles Emmanuel also boasted some claim to Monferrato through a niece or a granddaughter, sovereigns all married among themselves. And for some time he had wanted to lay hands on that marquisate that was a thorn in the side of his duchy, penetrating to within a few dozen miles of Turin. So, immediately after the naming of Nevers, Gonzalo de Cordoba, exploiting the ambitions of the Savoy Duke to frustrate those of the French, suggested joining the Spaniards in taking Monferrato, dividing the territory afterwards. The emperor, who already had his share of troubles with the rest of Europe, did not consent to the invasion, but neither did he pronounce himself against Nevers. Gonzalo and Charles Emmanuel acted promptly, and one of the two started by taking Alba, Trino, and Moncaldo. A good man but not a stupid one, the emperor sequestered Mantua, entrusting it to an imperial commissioner. This truce was to apply to all claimants, but Richelieu took it as an insult to France. Or else it suited him to take it as such. He did not act, however, for he was still besieging the Protestants of La Rochelle. Spain looked favorably on that massacre of a handful of heretics, and allowed Gonzalo to exploit it to muster 8,000 men and lay siege to Kausali, defended by little more than 200 soldiers. That was the first siege of Kausali. But as the emperor showed no sign of giving way, Charles Emmanuel sensed the bad turn things were taking and, while still collaborating with the Spanish, he sent secret messages to Richelieu. In the meantime La Rochelle was taken. Richelieu was congratulated by the court of Madrid on this fine victory of the faith. He expressed his thanks, reassembled his army and, with Louis XIII at its head, he sent it across the Montenegro Pass in February of 29 and deployed it before Susa. Charles Emmanuel realized that by playing a double game, he risked losing not only Monferrato but also Susa, so, trying to sell what they were taking from him, he offered Susa in exchange for a French city. One of Roberto's table companions recalled the affair in an amused tone. Richelieu, with fine sarcasm, inquired whether the Duke preferred Orléans or Poitiers, and at the same time a French officer presented himself to the Susa garrison and requested lodging for the King of France. The Savoy commander, a man of wit, replied that His Highness the Duke would no doubt be happy to welcome His Majesty, but inasmuch as His Majesty had come with such a large suite, they should allow the commander first to inform His Highness. With equal elegance the Marshal of Bassompierre, cantering over the snow, doffed his hat before his king and, after informing him that the violins had entered and the mummers were at the door, asked his permission to open the dance. Richelieu celebrated a field mass, the French infantry attacked, and Susa was conquered. Seeing how things then stood, Charles Emmanuel decided that Louis XIII was a most welcome guest and came out to receive him, asking him only not to waste time at Kausali, which was already being dealt with, but to help him take Genoa instead. He was courteously invited not to talk nonsense and was given a handsome goose quill to sign a treaty allowing the French freedom of action in Piedmont. Charles Emmanuel managed to retain Trino as a consolation and was authorized to exact an annual rent from the Duke of Mantua for Monferrato. And so Nevers, the officer said, to keep what was his, agreed to pay rent to someone who had never been its owner. And he paid. Another man laughed. Quel con. Nevers has always had to pay for his follies, said an abbé who had been introduced to Roberto as Torres's confessor. Nevers is a jester of God, convinced that he is Saint Bernard. He has always been dominated solely by the idea of assembling the Christian princes for a new crusade. These are times when the Christians are killing one another. Who gives a thought to the infidels these days? Gentlemen of Casale, if a stone or two is left of this city, you must expect your new lord to invite all of you to Jerusalem. The abbé smiled, amused, stroking his well-trimmed blonde mustache, as Roberto was thinking. So it goes. This morning I was about to die for a madman, and this madman is called mad because he dreams, as I used to dream, of the days of the fair Melisende and the leper king. Nor did subsequent events allow Roberto to untangle the motives behind this story. Betrayed by Charles Emmanuel, Gonzalo de Córdoba realized that he had lost the campaign, recognized the Susa agreement, and led his 8,000 men back into Milanese territory. A French garrison was installed at Casale, another at Susa. The rest of Louis's army crossed the Alps again to wipe out the last Huguenots in Languedoc and the valley of the Rhône. But none of those gentlemen had any intention of honoring pacts, and the officers seated around the table told the whole story as if it was all entirely natural. Indeed, some agreed and remarked, La raison d'estat. Ah, la raison d'estat. For reasons of state Olivares, Roberto gathered that he was some sort of Spanish Richelieu, but less blessed with luck. Realized he had cut a sorry figure, unceremoniously dismissed Gonzalo, and put Ambrogio Spinola in his place, repeating that the insult offered to Spain was detrimental to the church. Rubbish, the abbé interjected. Urban VIII favored the succession of Nevers, and Roberto wondered what the Pope had to do with matters not involving questions of faith. Meanwhile the emperor, and there was no telling the 1,000 different ways Olivares put pressure on him, remembered that Mantua was in the hands of a commissioner, and Nevers could neither pay nor not pay for something that was still not his due. The emperor lost patience and sent 20,000 men to besiege the city. The Pope, seeing Protestant mercenaries running about Italy, immediately imagined another sack of Rome and sent troops to the Mantuan border. Spinola, more ambitious and determined than Gonzalo, decided to besiege Casale again, but seriously this time. In short, Roberto privately concluded, if you would avoid wars, never make treaties of peace. In December of 29 the French again crossed the Alps. According to their pacts, Charles Emmanuel should have let them pass, but, evidence of his reliability, he reiterated his claims to the Monferrato and demanded 6,000 French soldiers to besiege Genoa, which was really an obsession of his. Richelieu, who considered him a snake, said neither yes nor no. A captain, who dressed at Casale as if he were at court, described one day of the past February, a marvelous feast, my friends. The musicians of the royal palace were missing, but the fanfares were there. His Majesty, followed by the army, rode before all Turin in a black suit worked in gold, a plume in his hat, and his cuirass gleaming. Roberto was expecting an account of a great attack, but no, this occasion was merely another parade. The king did not attack, he made a surprise diversion to Pinerolo and appropriated it, or reappropriated it, since a few hundred years earlier it had been a French city. Roberto had a vague idea of where Pinerolo was, and he could not understand how taking it would relieve Casale. Are we also under siege at Pinerolo perhaps, he wondered. The Pope, worried by the turn things were taking, sent his representative to Richelieu, urging him to return the city to the Savoys. At table then they gossiped abundantly about that envoy, one Giulio Mazarini, a Sicilian, a Roman plebeian. No, the abbé insisted, the natural son of an obscure officer from the mountains south of Rome. Somehow this Mazarini had become a captain in the service of the Pope, but he was doing everything he could to win the confidence of Richelieu, whose great favorite he now was. And he was someone to keep an eye on, for at that moment he was at Ratisbon, or on his way there, which is at the end of the earth, but it was in Ratisbon that the fate of Casale would be decided, not in some mine or countermine. Meanwhile, as Charles Emmanuel was trying to cut lines of communication with the French troops, Richelieu also took Annecy and Chambéry, and Savoyards and French were fighting at Avigliana. In this slow game, the Imperials were entering Lorraine to threaten France. Wallenstein was moving to help the Savoys, and in July a handful of Imperials, transported on barges, took by surprise a lock at Mantua. The whole army had overrun the city, sacked it for 70 hours, emptying the ducal palace from top to bottom and, to reassure the Pope, the Lutherans of the Imperial army had despoiled every church in the city. Yes, those same Landsknechts that Roberto had seen arriving to lend Spinola a helping hand. The French army was still engaged in the north, and no one could say if it would arrive in time, before Casale fell. They could only hope in God, the abbé said. Gentlemen, it is political wisdom to realize that human means must always be sought, as if divine means did not exist, and divine means sought, as if human means did not exist. So let us hope in divine means, one gentleman exclaimed, but with an expression anything but devout, waving his cup until he had spilled some wine on the abbé's cassock. Sir, you have stained me with wine, the abbé cried, blanching, which was the form indignation took in those days. Pretend, the other replied, that the mishap occurred during the consecration. Wine is wine. Monsieur de Saint-Savin, the abbé cried, rising and putting his hand to his sword, this is not the first time you have dishonored your own name by taking our lords in vain. You would have done better, God forgive me, to stay in Paris dishonoring the ladies, as is the custom with you Pyrrhonians. Come, come, Saint-Savin replied, obviously drunk, we Pyrrhonians went about at night to provide music for the ladies, and the men of courage who wanted to enjoy some fine jest would join us. But when the lady failed to come to her window, we knew she preferred to remain in the bed the family confessor was warming for her. The other officers had risen and were restraining the abbé, who tried to draw his sword. Monsieur de Saint-Savin is in his cups, they said to him. Allowances had to be made for a man who had fought well those recent days, out of respect for the comrades who had just died. So be it, the abbé concluded, leaving the hall. Monsieur de Saint-Savin, I invite you to end the night reciting a De Profundis for our fallen friends, and I will then consider myself satisfied. The abbé went out, and Saint-Savin, who was sitting next to Roberto, leaned on his shoulder and commented, dogs and riverbirds make less noise than we do shouting a De Profundis. Why all the bell ringing and all the masses to resuscitate the dead? He abruptly drained his cup, admonished Roberto with a raised finger, as if to direct him to a proper life and to the supreme mysteries of our holy religion. Sir, be proud. Today you came close to a happy death, and behave in future with the same nonchalance, knowing that the soul dies with the body. Go then to death after having savored life. We are animals among animals, all children of matter, save that we are the more disarmed. But since, unlike animals, we know we must die, let us prepare for that moment by enjoying the life that has been given us by chance and for chance. Let wisdom teach us to employ our days in drinking and amiable conversation, as is proper to gentlemen scorning base spirits. Comrades, life is in our debt. We are rotting at Casali, and we were born too late to enjoy the times of the good King Henry, when at the Louvre you encountered bastards, monkeys, madmen and court buffoons, dwarfs and legless beggars, castrati and poets, and the king was amused by them. Now Jesuits lascivious as rams fulminate against the readers of Rabelais and the Latin poets, and would have us all be virtuous and kill the Huguenots. Lord God, war is a beautiful thing. But I want to fight for my own pleasure and not because my adversary eats meat on Friday. The pagans were wiser than we. They had their 3 gods, but at least their mother Cybele did not claim to give birth and yet remain a virgin. Sir, Roberto protested, as the others laughed. Sir, Saint-Savin replied, the first quality of an honest man is contempt for religion, which would have us afraid of the most natural thing in the world, which is death, and would have us hate the one beautiful thing destiny has given us, which is life. We should rather aspire to a heaven where only the planets live in eternal bliss, receiving neither rewards nor condemnations, but enjoying merely their own eternal motion in the arms of the void. Be strong like the sages of ancient Greece and look at death with steady eye and no fear. Jesus sweated too much, awaiting it. Why should he have been afraid, for that matter, since he was going to rise again? That will do, Monsieur de Saint-Savin, an officer virtually ordered him, taking him by the arm. Do not scandalize this young friend of ours, as yet unaware that in Paris nowadays blasphemy is the most exquisite form of bon ton. He might take you too seriously. And you, Monsieur de Lagrive, go to bed, too. Remember that the good Lord, in his mercy, will forgive even Monsieur de Saint-Savin. As that theologian said, strong is a king who destroys all, stronger still is a woman who obtains all, but strongest is wine, which drowns reason. You quote by halves, sir, Saint-Savin mumbled as 2 of his comrades were dragging him out almost bodily. That phrase is attributed to the tongue, which added, stronger still, however, is truth and I who speak it. And my tongue, even if it now moves with difficulty, will not be silent. The wise man must attack falsehood not only with his sword but also with his tongue. My friends, how can you call merciful a divinity that desires our eternal unhappiness only to appease his rage of an instant? We must forgive our neighbor, and he need not? And we should love such a cruel being? The abbé calls me Pyrrhonian, but we Pyrrhonians, if he must so call us, are concerned with consoling the victims of imposture. Once 3 companions and I distributed rosaries with obscene medals among some ladies. If you only knew how devout they became immediately thereafter. He went out, accompanied by the laughter of the whole company, and the officer remarked, if God will not pardon his tongue, at least we will, for he has such a beautiful sword. Then he said to Roberto, keep him as your friend, and don't vex him any more than necessary. He has felled more Frenchmen in Paris over a point of theology than my whole company has run through Spaniards here. I would not want him next to me at Mass, but I would consider myself fortunate to have him beside me on the field. Thus introduced to his first doubts, Roberto was to acquire more the following day. Returning to collect his pack in that wing of the castle where he had slept the first nights with his Montferrini, he had trouble orienting himself among the corridors and courtyards. He was going along a passage when he realized he had taken a wrong turn, and at the end of the hall he saw a mirror dulled with dirt, in which he spied himself. But as he approached, he realized that this self had, certainly, his face, but wore gaudy Spanish-style clothing, and his hair was gathered in a little net. Further, this self, at a certain point, no longer faced him, but withdrew to one side. It was not a mirror. It was in fact a window with dusty panes overlooking an external rampart from which a stairway descended towards the courtyard. So he had seen not himself but someone very like him, whose trail he had now lost. Naturally he thought at once of Ferranti. Ferranti had followed him to Casale, or had preceded him, and perhaps belonged to another company of the same regiment, or to one of the French regiments, and while Roberto was risking his life at the outwork, the other was reaping God knows what advantages from the war. At that age Roberto tended to smile at his boyhood imaginings of Ferranti, and reflecting on his vision, he quickly convinced himself that he had seen only someone who vaguely resembled him. He chose to forget the incident. For years he had brooded over an invisible brother, and that evening he thought he had seen him, but, he told himself, trying with his reason to contradict his heart, if he had seen someone, it was not a figment, and since Ferranti was a figment, the man seen could not have been Ferranti. A master of logic would have refuted that paralogism, but for the present it satisfied Roberto. Chapter 6. The Great Art of Light and Shadow. After devoting his letter to the first memories of the siege, Roberto found some bottles of Spanish wine in the captain's quarters. We can hardly reproach him if, having lit the fire and cooked himself a pan of eggs with bits of smoked fish, he opened a bottle and permitted himself a regal supper on a table laid almost to perfection. If he was destined to remain a castaway for a long time, he had to maintain good manners and not become bestialized. He remembered how at Casale, when wounds and sickness were causing even the officers to behave like castaways, Monsieur de Torres requested that, at table at least, each should bear in mind what he had learned in Paris. To appear in clean clothes, not to drink after each mouthful, but first to wipe mustache and beard, not to lick one's fingers or spit in the plate, not to blow one's nose into one's napkin. We are not imperials, gentlemen. He woke the next morning at cockcrow, but he dawdled at length. When in the gallery he again opened the window a crack, he realized he had risen later than the day before, and dawn was already becoming sunrise. Behind the hills now the pink of the sky was more intense, as the clouds drifted away. Since the first rays would soon strike the beach, making it intolerable to his sight, Roberto thought of looking to where the sun was not yet predominant, and he moved along the gallery to the other side of the Daphne, towards the western land. It immediately appeared to him as a jagged turquoise outline, which in a few minutes' time was divided into two horizontal strips. A brush of greenery and pale palm trees already blazing below the dark area of the mountains, over which the clouds of night obstinately continued to rain. But slowly these clouds, still coal-black in the center, were shredding at the edges in a medley of white and pink. It was as if the sun, rather than confront them, was ingeniously trying to emerge from inside them, though the light unraveled at their borders as they grew dense with fog, rebelling against their liquefaction in the sky in order that it become the faithful mirror of the sea, now wondrously wan, dazzled by sparkling patches, as if shoals of fish passed, each fitted with an inner lamp. Soon, however, the clouds succumbed to the lure of the light, and yielded, abandoning themselves above the peaks, while on one side they adhered to the slopes, condensing and settling like cream, soft where it trickled down, more compact at the summit, forming a glacier, and on the other side making snow at the top, a single lava of ice exploding in the air in the shape of a mushroom, an exquisite eruption in a land of cocaine. What he saw was perhaps enough to justify his shipwreck, not so much for the pleasure that this fickle, attitudinizing nature afforded him, but for the light that this light cast on words he had heard from the canon of Digne. Until now, in fact, he had often asked himself if he was not dreaming. What was happening to him did not usually happen to humans, at best it evoked the novels of childhood. Like dream creatures were the ship and the animals he had encountered on it, of the same substance as dreams were the shadows that for 3 days had enfolded him. On cold consideration he realized also that even the colors he had admired in the garden and in the aviary appeared dazzling to his amazed eyes alone, that in reality they were heightened only thanks to that patina, like an old lutz, that covered every object on the ship, a light that had already enveloped beams and casks of seasoned wood encrusted with paint, pitch, oils. Could not, then, the great theater of celestial cruise, which he now thought he saw on the horizon, be likewise a dream? No, Roberto told himself, the pain that this light now causes my eyes informs me that I am not dreaming, I see. My pupils are suffering because of the storm of atoms that like a great warship bombards me from that shore, for vision is nothing but the encounter of the eye with the powder of matter that strikes it. To be sure, as the canon had said to him, it is not that objects from a distance send you, as Epicurus had it, perfect simulacra that reveal both the exterior form and the concealed nature. You receive only signals, clues, and you arrive at the conjecture we call vision. But the very fact that Roberto, a moment before, had named through various tropes what he believed he saw, creating in the form of words what the still formless something suggested to him, now confirmed for him that he was indeed seeing. Among the many certainties whose lack he complained of, one alone is present, and it is that all things appear to us as they appear to us, and it is impossible for them to appear otherwise. Whereby, seeing and being sure he was seeing. Roberto had the unique sureness on which senses and reason can rely, the certainty that he was seeing something, and this something was the sole form of being of which he could speak, for it was nothing but the great theater of the visible arranged in the basin of space. Which conclusion tells us much about that bizarre century. He was alive, awake, and an island lay over there, or perhaps a continent. What it was he did not know, for colors depend on the object that affects them, on the light that is refracted in them, and on the eye that fixes them. Thus even the most distant land appeared real to his excited and afflicted eyes, in their transient marriage to that light, to those winds and clouds. Perhaps tomorrow, or in a few hours' time, that land would be different. What he saw was not just the message the sky was sending him, but the result of a friendship among sky, earth, and the position, and the hour, the season, the angle, from which he was observing. Surely, if the ship were anchored along another line crossing the rhombus of the winds, the spectacle would have been different. The sun, the dawn, the sea and land would have been another sun, another dawn, a sea and land twins but distorted. That infinity of worlds of which Saint Savin spoke to him was to be sought beyond the constellations, in the very center of this bubble of space of which he, pure eye, was now the source of infinite parallaxes. We must grant Roberto one thing. In all his vicissitudes then, he did not press his speculations beyond that point, whether in metaphysics or in the physics of bodies. Though, as we will see, he was to do so later, and go farther than he should have. But here we find him already reflecting that if there could be a single world in which appeared different islands, for many Robertos who observed them from many ships positioned at different degrees of the meridian, then in that single world many Robertos and many Ferrantes could appear and mingle. Perhaps on that day at the castle he had moved, without realizing it, a few yards with respect to the highest hill on the Isla de Hierro and had seen a universe inhabited by another Roberto, a Roberto not sentenced to the conquest of the outwork beyond the walls or saved by another father who did not kill the polite Spaniard. But Roberto surely recurred to these considerations rather than confess that the distant body, made and unmade in voluptuous metamorphosis, had become for him the anagram of another body, which he would have liked to possess. And as this land smiled languidly at him, he would have liked to join it and commingle with it, blissful pygmy on the bosom of a lovely giantess. I do not believe, however, that it was modesty that prompted him to retire, but, rather, the fear of excessive light, and perhaps another summons. He had, in fact, heard the hens announcing a new provision of eggs, and he had the thought of treating himself that evening to a pullet roasted on a spit. But he took the time to trim, with the captain's scissors, his mustache, beard, and hair, all still a castaway's. He had decided to enjoy his shipwreck like a holiday in a country villa, which offered him an extended suite of dawns, daybreaks, and, he savored in anticipation, sunsets. So less than an hour after the hens' cackling, he went below and immediately realized that while they must have laid their eggs, for their cackling could not have been a lie, there was not an egg to be seen. And, further, all the birds had fresh feed, neatly distributed, still untouched. Curious as it may seem, his first feeling was of jealousy. Someone else was master of his ship and stole from him those cares and those perquisites to which he was entitled. Losing the world to gain an abandoned vessel only to find that someone else inhabited it seemed to him as unbearable as the fear that his lady, inaccessible goal of his desire, might become prey to the desire of another. Then a more rational concern ensued. Just as the world of his childhood had been inhabited by another who preceded him and followed him, clearly the Daphne had holds and quarters he did not yet know, where a hidden guest lived, who followed his steps the moment he had gone, or took them a moment before he did. He ran to hide, too, in his berth, like the African ostrich that, hiding his head, thinks to erase the world. To reach the quarterdeck he passed the top of a ladder that descended to the hold. What could be hidden down there, considering that on the lower deck he had found a miniature island? Was that the realm of the intruder? You see, he was already acting towards the ship as towards an object of love which, once it is discovered and you discover you desire it, makes all who had previously possessed it seem usurpers. And it is at this point that Roberto confesses, writing to the lady, that when he saw her for the first time, and he saw her because his eyes followed another man's gaze addressed to her, he felt the revulsion of one who espies a caterpillar on a rose. Such an access of jealousy for a vessel redolent of fish, smoke, and feces might almost provoke a smile, but by now Roberto was becoming lost in a shifting maze where every junction led him back always to a single image. He suffered doubly, because of the island he did not have and because of the ship that had him, both unattainable, one through its distance, the other through its enigma. And both stood for a beloved who eluded him, blandishing him with promises that he made to himself alone. I cannot otherwise explain this letter in which Roberto pours out embellished laments only to say, basically, that someone had deprived him of his morning meal. My lady, how can I expect mercy from one who is destroying me? And yet to whom, if not to you, can I confide my suffering, seeking solace, if not in your listening, at least in my unlistened to words? If love is a medicine that heals every pain with a yet greater pain, can I not perhaps conceive of it as a suffering that kills through excess every other suffering, until it becomes a balm for all save itself? For if ever I saw beauty and wanted it, it was only in the dream of you, and why should I lament that another beauty is for me equally a dream? It would be worse if I made that beauty mine and were sated with it, no longer suffering with the image of you. For scarce balm would I enjoy, and the sickness would increase in the remorse for that infidelity. Better to trust in your image, the more so now that I have glimpsed once again an enemy whose features I do not know and perhaps wish never to know. To ignore this hated phantom, may your beloved phantom sustain me. May love make of me at least an insensitive fragment, a mandragora, a fountain of stone that weeps away every anguish. But, tormenting himself as he does, Roberto does not become a fountain of stone, and he promptly connects the anguish he is feeling to the other anguish he felt at Casali, this with effects, as we shall see, far more dire. Chapter 7. Pavane Lacrimae. The story is as clear as it is dark. While little skirmishes followed one another, as in a game of chess where not a move but the mere expression that accompanies the hint of a move works to make the opponent renounce a winning opportunity, Torres concluded that a more substantial sortie had to be attempted. Clearly the game was being played between spies and counterspies. At Casale rumor had it that the relief army was near, led by the king himself, while Monsieur de Montmorency was coming from Asti and the marshals de Crequi and La Force from Ivry. Falsehoods, as Roberto learned from the wrath of Torres when he received a courier from the north. In this exchange of messages Torres informed Richelieu that he was now without victuals, and the cardinal replied that Monsieur Agincourt had in due course inspected the storerooms and determined that Casale could hold out excellently throughout the summer. The army would move in August, taking advantage along the way of the harvests just reaped. Roberto was amazed when Torres instructed some Corsicans to desert and go over to Spinola, reporting that the army was not expected until September. But then he heard the commander explain to his staff, if Spinola believes he has time, he will take time to dig his tunnels, and we will have time to dig our own tunnels against his mines. But if he thinks reinforcements are about to arrive, what course is left him? Surely not to confront the French army, because he knows he hasn't sufficient troops, not to wait for it, because then he himself would be besieged, not to return to Milan and prepare a defense of that region, because honor forbids retreat. So the only thing left for him is to conquer Casale at once. But since he cannot do that with a frontal attack, he will have to spend a fortune in purchasing betrayal. And from that moment on, every friend will become for us an enemy. So we will send spies to Spinola, to convince him of the delay of our relief, we will allow him to dig his tunnels for mines where they will not bother us too much, and we will destroy those that are really a threat to us, and we will let him wear himself out in this game. Signor Pozzo, you know the land. Where should we leave him undisturbed and where should we thwart him at all costs? Old Pozzo, without looking at the maps, which seemed to him too ornate to be accurate, and pointing with one hand out of the window, explained how in certain areas the terrain was notoriously treacherous, infiltrated by the waters of the river, and their Spinola could dig as long as he pleased and his sappers would choke to death on snails. Whereas in other areas digging tunnels was child's play, and there they should hammer with the artillery and make sorties. Very well, said Torres. Tomorrow we will force them to move and defend their positions outside the San Carlo bastion, and then we'll surprise them outside the San Giorgio bastion. The game was well prepared, with detailed instructions to all companies. And since Roberto had proved good at writing, Torres kept him busy from 6 in the evening till 2 in the morning, dictating messages, then asked him to sleep, dressed, on a bench outside his room and receive and look over the replies, waking him if there were any contretemps. Which there were, and more than once, between 2 o'clock and dawn. The next morning the troops were in readiness on the covered way above the counterscarp and inside the walls. At a signal from Torres, who was overlooking everything from the citadel, the first contingent, fairly numerous, moved in the deceitful direction. A vanguard of pikemen and musketeers, with a reserve of 50 arquebuses closely following, and after them, shamelessly, an infantry corps of 500 men and 2 companies of cavalry. It was a fine parade, and later everyone realized that this was precisely how the Spaniards had taken it. Roberto saw 35 men who, obeying Captain Colombat, scattered and attacked a ditch. The Spanish captain emerged from the barricade and gave them a great salute. Colombat and his men, out of politeness, stopped and responded with equal courtesy. After which, the Spaniards seemed ready to withdraw and the French marked time. Torres ordered his cannon to fire at the trench from the walls. Colombat took the hint, ordered the attack. The cavalry followed him, assailing the ditch from both flanks. The Spaniards reluctantly resumed their position and were overrun. The French seemed crazed and some, as they fought, shouted the names of friends killed in previous engagements. This is for Bessiers, this for the Bricchetto farm. Their furor was such that when Colombat wanted to reassemble the squad, he failed. Some of the men were still fiercely striking the fallen, others turned towards the city, shaking earrings, belts, scalps, and other trophies on their raised pikes. There was no immediate counterattack, and Torres made the mistake of considering that an error of the enemy, whereas it was calculated. Believing that the Imperials were bent on sending more troops to contain that assault, Torres goaded them with more cannonades, but the men merely fired into the city, and one ball damaged the church of Sant'Antonio, quite near staff headquarters. Torres was content, and ordered another group to move out from the San Giorgio bastion. Only a few companies, but they were commanded by Monsieur de Lagrange, lively as a stripling despite his 55 years. Sword extended before him, Lagrange ordered a charge against a little abandoned church, alongside which the construction of a tunnel was already far advanced. But suddenly, from behind a gully, the main body of the enemy army appeared, having waited hours for this rendezvous. Betrayal, Torres shouted, rushing down to the gate, where he ordered Lagrange to fall back. A little later, an ensign of the Pompadour regiment brought before Torres a boy of Casale, his wrists bound by a cord. He had been caught in a little tower near the castle, signaling with a white cloth to the besiegers. Torres had him laid on the ground. He stuck the thumb of the boy's right hand into the raised cock of his pistol, pointing the barrel towards the boy's left hand. After putting his own finger on the trigger, Torres asked, "Et alors?" The boy quickly realized the bad turn things were taking, and began to talk. The previous evening, towards midnight, outside the church of San Domenico, a certain Captain Gambaro had promised him 6 pistoles, 3 in advance, if he would do what he then had done, at the moment when the French troops moved from the San Giorgio bastion. Indeed, not having grasped the military art, the boy seemed to demand the outstanding 3 pistoles, as if Torres should be pleased with his service. At a certain point he saw Roberto and started shouting that this was the notorious Gambaro. Roberto was stunned. The older Pozo fell on the slanderous wretch and would have strangled him if some gentleman of the staff had not restrained him. Torres immediately pointed out that Roberto had been all night at his side and that, though he was surely a fine-looking youth, nobody could mistake him for a captain. In the meantime others had ascertained that a Captain Gambaro really did exist, in the Bassiani regiment, and they hailed him, kicking and shoving, into Torres's presence. Gambaro protested his innocence, and in fact the boy prisoner did not recognize him, but Torres prudently had the officer locked up anyway. Capping the disorder, someone came to report that as Lagrange's troops were retreating, a man had fled from the San Giorgio bastion, reaching the Spanish lines, to be greeted with manifestations of joy. Not much could be said about him except that he was young, dressed in the Spanish style with a net over his hair. Roberto thought at once of Ferranti. But what made the deepest impression on him was the suspicion with which the French commanders looked at the Italians in Torres's train. "Can one little rascal stop a whole army?" he heard his father ask, nodding towards the retiring French. "Forgive me, dear friend," Pozo said, addressing Torres, "but here the idea is growing that, in our parts, we are all a bit like that rogue Gambaro, or am I mistaken?" And when Torres protested esteem and friendship, but in an absent tone, Pozo went on, "Let it go. It seems to me everyone's shitting his pants, and this business is more than I can take. I've had a bellyful of those lousy Spaniards, and if you don't mind, I'll knock off 2 or 3 just to show we can dance the galliard when we have to. And if we feel like it, we don't bow down before anybody, mordieu." He then rode outside the gate and galloped like a fury, his sword raised, against the enemy host. He obviously didn't mean to put them to flight, but it seemed proper to him to act on his own, just to show the others. As proof of his courage, it was good; as a military action, very bad. A ball struck his forehead and he slumped onto the withers of his panoply. A second volley rose against the rampart, and Roberto felt a violent blow to the temple. Like a stone, he staggered. He had been grazed, but he freed himself from the arms of the man supporting him. Shouting his father's name, he stood erect and glimpsed Panoply, bewildered, galloping with his master's lifeless body across the empty field. Once again Roberto thrust his fingers into his mouth and emitted his whistle. Panoply heard and came back towards the walls, but slowly, at a solemn little trot, so as not to unsaddle his rider, no longer imperiously pressing his flanks. The horse came in again, neighing his pavane for his dead master, returning the body to Roberto, who closed those still wide eyes and wiped clean that face spattered with blood now clotted, while his own blood, alive, striped his cheek. That shot may have touched a nerve. The next day, as soon as he came out of the Cathedral of Sant'Evasio, where Torres had decreed the solemn obsequies of the Lord Pozo di San Patrizio della Griva, Roberto could hardly tolerate the light of day. Perhaps his eyes were red from tears, but the fact remains that from then on, they continued to ache. Today students of the psyche would say that because his father had entered the shadows, Roberto also wanted to enter the shadows. He knew little of the psyche, but this figure of speech might have appealed to him, in the light, or in the shadows, of what happened later. "I consider that Pozo died of punctilio, which seems superb to me," but Roberto was unable to appreciate it. All praised his father's heroism to him. He should have borne his bereavement with pride, and here he was sobbing. Recalling how his father had told him that a gentleman must learn to bear, dry-eyed, the blows of adverse fortune, he apologized for his weakness to his parent, who could no longer call him to account, and repeated to himself that this was the first time he had been orphaned. He thought he would become accustomed to the idea, not yet understanding that it is useless to become accustomed to the loss of a father, for it will never happen a second time. Might as well leave the wound open. But to give some sense to what had happened, he could not help falling back, once again, on Ferranti. Ferranti, following him closely, had sold to the enemy the secrets he knew and then shamelessly had joined the adversary's ranks to enjoy the well-earned reward. His father, who had realized this, wanted thus to cleanse the stained escutcheon of the family and to bathe Roberto in the glow of his own courage, to purify him of that aura of suspicion just cast on him, who was blameless. To make sure his father's death was not in vain, Roberto owed to him the conduct that all at Casale expected of the hero's son. He could not do otherwise. He found himself now the legitimate lord of La Griva, heir to the family name and possessions, and Torres no longer dared employ him for little tasks, nor could he call on him for big ones. And so, left alone to sustain his new role of illustrious orphan, Roberto found himself still more alone, lacking even the comfort of action. At the heart of a siege, released from all duties, he asked himself how he should spend his days as a besieged soldier. Chapter 8. The curious learning of the wits of the day. Arresting for a moment the wave of memories, Roberto realized he had evoked his father's death not with the pious intention of keeping open that Philoctetes' wound, but by mere accident, as he was summoning up the spectre of Ferranti, elicited by the spectre of the intruder of the Daphne. The two now appeared to him as such obvious twins that he decided to eliminate the weaker in order to overpower the stronger. In the final analysis, he said to himself, during those days of siege did I ever have any other hint of Ferranti? Know what happened then? I was convinced of his non-existence by Saint Savin. Roberto had in fact made friends with Monsieur de Saint Savin. He had seen him again at the funeral, and had received a demonstration of affection from him. When not prey to wine, Saint Savin was an accomplished gentleman. Small of stature, nervous, brisk, and though his face was perhaps marked by the Parisian dissipation of which he spoke, he could not have been 30. He apologized for his excesses at that supper, not for what he had said, but for his uncivil way of saying it. He inquired about Monsieur Pozzo, and Roberto was grateful to him for at least feigning interest. Roberto told how his father had taught him what he knew of fencing. Saint Savin asked various questions, waxed enthusiastic at the mention of a certain thrust, drew his sword right in the middle of a square and insisted that Roberto illustrate the action. Either Saint Savin already knew it or he was very quick, because he parried it with dexterity, though admitting that it was an invention worthy of the haute école. In gratitude he indicated only one stratagem of his own to Roberto. He put him on guard, they traded a few feints, he awaited the first attack, suddenly he seemed to slip to the ground, and when Roberto dropped his guard, speechless, Saint Savin rose as if by miracle and snipped a button off his tunic, showing that he could have wounded him had he thrust harder. "You like that, my friend?" he said, as Roberto saluted, conceding defeat. "It's the coup de la muette, the seagull thrust, as it's called. If you go to sea one day, you will observe how those birds dive abruptly as if they were falling, but when they have barely grazed the water, they soar up again with their catch in their beaks. It is a move that requires long practice, and it is not infallible. In my experience, it failed once, for the braggart who invented it. And so he made me a gift both of his life and of his secret. I believe he was sorrier to part with the second than with the first." They would have gone on at length if a little crowd of civilians had not collected. "Shall we stop?" Roberto said. "I would not want someone to say I have forgotten I am in mourning." "You honor your father better now," Saint Savin said, "by remembering his teachings, than you did before, listening to that execrable Latin in church." "Monsieur de Saint Savin," Roberto said to him, "are you not afraid of ending up at the stake?" Saint Savin frowned for a moment. "When I was more or less your age, I admired a man who had been an older brother to me. Like an ancient philosopher I called him Lucretius, for he, too, was a philosopher and moreover a priest. He ended up at the stake in Toulouse, but first they tore out his tongue and strangled him. And so you see that if we philosophers are quick of tongue, it is not simply, as that gentleman said the other evening, to give ourselves bon ton. It is to put the tongue to good use before they rip it out. Or, rather, jesting aside, to dispel prejudice and to discover the natural cause of creation. So you truly do not believe in God? I find no reason to, in nature. Nor am I the only one. Strabo tells us that the Galicians had no notion of a higher being. When the missionaries wanted to talk of God with the natives of the West Indies, Acosta recounts, and he was also a Jesuit, they could use only the Spanish word Dios. You will not believe it, but no suitable term existed in the local language. If the idea of God is unknown in the state of nature, it must then be a human invention. But do not look at me as if I lacked sound principles and were not a faithful servant of my king. A true philosopher never seeks to subvert the order of things. He accepts it. He asks only to be allowed to cultivate the thoughts that comfort a strong spirit. For the others, luckily there are both popes and bishops to restrain the crowd from revolt and crime. The order of the state demands a uniformity of conduct, religion is necessary for the people, and the wise man must sacrifice a part of his independence so that society will remain stable. As for me, I believe I am an upright man. I am loyal to my friends, I do not lie, except when I make a declaration of love, I love knowledge, and they say I write good verses. So the ladies consider me charming. I would like to write romances, which are so much in fashion, but though I think of many, I never sit down to write one. What romances do you think of? Sometimes I look at the moon, and I imagine that those darker spots are caverns, cities, islands, and the places that shine are those where the sea catches the light of the sun like the glass of a mirror. I would like to tell the stories of their kings, their wars, and their revolutions, or of the unhappiness of lovers up there, who in the course of their nights sigh as they look down at our earth. I would like to tell about war and friendship among the various parts of the body, the arms that do battle with the feet, and the veins that make love with the arteries, or the bones with the marrow. All the stories I would like to write persecute me. When I am in my chamber, it seems as if they are all around me, like little devils, and while one tugs at my ear, another tweaks my nose, and each says to me, "Sir, write me, I am beautiful." Then I realize that an equally beautiful story can be told, inventing an original duel, for example, a man fighting and convincing his adversary to deny God, then running him through so that he dies damned. Stop, Monsieur de la Greve, draw your sword once again, like that, parry, there. You set your heels along the same line, a mistake, for you jeopardize the steadiness of your legs. The head must not be held erect, because the space between the shoulder and the neck exposes an excessive surface to the blows of the adversary. But I protect my head with the sword in my extended hand. Wrong, in that position you are weaker. Besides, I opened with the German stance, and you placed yourself in the Italian position. Bad idea. When a ready position has to be countered, you should imitate it as closely as possible. But you have told me nothing of yourself, of your experiences before you turned up in this valley of dust. More than anyone, an adult able to dazzle with perverse paradoxes can fascinate a youth, who immediately wants to emulate him. Roberto opened his heart to Saint Savin, and to make himself interesting, since the first 16 years of his life offered scant material, he recounted his obsession with his unknown brother. "You have read too many romances," Saint Savin said to him, "and you try to live one. But the purpose of a story is to teach and please at once, and what it teaches is how to recognize the snares of the world. And what might I be taught by what you consider the romance of Ferrante?" "A romance," Saint Savin explained to him, "must always have at its base a misconception of a person, action, place, time, circumstance, and from that fundamental misconception episodic misconceptions must arise, developments, digressions, and finally unexpected and pleasant recognitions. By misconception I mean things like a living person's reported death, or one person's being killed in place of another, or a misconception of quantity, as when a woman believes her lover dead and marries another, or of quality, when it is the judgment of the senses that errs, when someone who appears dead is then buried, while actually he is under the influence of a sleeping potion, or else a misconception of relation, as when one man is wrongly believed the murderer of another, or of instrument, as when one man pretends to stab another using a weapon whose tip, while seeming to wound, does not pierce the throat but retracts into the sleeve, pressing a sponge soaked in blood. Not to mention forged letters, assumed voices, messages not delivered in time or delivered to the wrong place or into the wrong hands. And of these stratagems the most celebrated, but too common, is that involving the mistaking of one person for another, the mistake being explained by the double. The double is a reflection that the character pulls behind himself or that precedes him in every situation. A fine machination, whereby the reader identifies with the main character, sharing his fear of an enemy brother. But you see how man is also machine, and it suffices to turn one wheel on the surface and other wheels then turn inside. The brother and the enmity are merely the reflection of the fear that each man has of himself, of the recesses of his own soul, where unconfessed desires lurk, or, as they are saying in Paris, unconscious concepts. For it has been demonstrated that imperceptible thoughts exist, affecting the soul without the soul's being aware of them, clandestine thoughts whose existence is demonstrated by the fact that, however little each of us examines himself, he will not fail to remark that in his heart he bears love or hatred, joy or sorrow, while remaining unable to remember distinctly the thoughts that generated it. Then Ferrante, Roberto began, and Saint Savin concluded. Ferrante stands for your fears and your shame. Often men, rather than admit they are the authors of their fate, see this fate as a romance narrated by a fanciful and scoundrel author. But what would this parable, which I have unwittingly constructed, mean for me? Who knows? Perhaps you did not love your father as much as you think, you feared the harshness with which he wanted to punish your virtue, so for him you invented a sinner, to punish him not with your own sins but with those of another. Sir, you are speaking to a son who is still mourning his most beloved parent. I believe it is a greater sin to teach contempt of fathers than contempt of our Lord. Come, my dear Legrive. The philosopher must have the courage to criticize all the false teachings that have been inculcated in us, and among these is the absurd respect for old age, as if youth were not the greatest good and the highest merit. Tell me frankly, when a young man is capable of conceiving, judging, and acting, is he not perhaps more skillful in managing a family than some sexagenarian dullard, with snow on his head that has frozen his imagination? What we honor as prudence in our elders is simply panic in action. Would you be subject to them when laziness has weakened their muscles, hardened their arteries, evaporated their spirits, and sucked the marrow from their bones? If you adore a woman, is it not perhaps because of her beauty? Do you continue your genuflections after age has made a phantom of that body, now apt to remind you of the imminence of death? And if you behave thus with your mistresses, why should you not do the same with your old men? You will say that this old man is your father and that heaven promises you long life if you honor him. Who said so? Some ancient Jews who realized they could survive in the desert only by exploiting the fruit of their loins? If you believe that heaven grants you a single additional day of life because you have been your father's lapdog, you are deceived. Do you believe a respectful greeting that causes the plume of your hat to sweep the ground at your parents' feet can heal a malignant abscess or help you pass a stone? If that were so, physicians would not then prescribe their ghastly potions, but to rid you of the Italian sickness they would instead suggest 4 bows before supper to your Lord Father, and a kiss to your Lady Mother at bedtime. You will say to me that without that father you would not exist, nor you without his, and so on back to Melchizedek. But it is he who owes something to you, not you to him. You pay with many years of weeping for his momentary tickle of pleasure. You cannot believe what you are saying. Well, no, hardly ever. But the philosopher is like the poet. The latter composes ideal letters for an ideal nymph, only to plumb with his words the depths of passion. The philosopher tests the coldness of his gaze, to see how far he can undermine the fortress of bigotry. I would not have your respect for your father diminished, for you say he taught you well. But do not let memory make you melancholy. I see you weeping. Oh, that is not sorrow. It must be my head wound, which has affected my eyes. You should drink coffee. Coffee? I swear that in a short while it will be the fashion. It is a panacea. I will procure you some. It dries the cold humors, dispels wind, strengthens the liver, it is the sovereign cure for hydropsy and scabies, it restores the heart, relieves bellyache. Its steam, in fact, is recommended for fluxions of the eyes, buzzing in the ears, catarrh, room or heaviness of the nose, as you will. And then bury with your father the cumbersome brother you created for yourself. And, above all, fall in love. Love, better even than coffee. Suffering for a live being, you will allay the pain for a dead one. I have never loved a woman, Roberto confessed, blushing. I did not say a woman. It could be a man. Monsieur de Saint-Savin, Roberto cried. It is obvious you come from the provinces. At the height of embarrassment, Roberto took his leave, saying his eyes were too painful, and he put an end to that encounter. To explain to himself all he had heard, he decided that Saint-Savin had been teasing him, as with dueling, Saint-Savin had wanted to show how many artifices they knew in Paris. And Roberto had indeed come out looking like a provincial. And worse, in taking seriously that talk, he had sinned. Which would not have happened if he had taken everything in jest. He drew up a list of the sins he had committed by listening to those many propositions against faith, morals, the state, familial respect. And, thinking of his lapse, he was seized by further anguish. He remembered that, dying, his father had uttered a blasphemy. Chapter 9. The Aristotelian Telescope. And so the next day he went back to pray in the Cathedral of Sant'Evasio. He was also seeking refreshment. On that early June afternoon the sun beat down on half-deserted streets, as, at this moment, on the Daphne, he felt the heat spreading over the bay, the sides of the ship absorbed it, and the wood seemed red-hot. But then he had felt the need to confess both his own sin and his father's. In the nave he stopped a religious, who first said he was not of this parish but, seeing the look in the youth's eyes, consented and sat in a confessional to hear the penitent. Padre Emanuele cannot have been very old, perhaps 40, and according to Roberto he was florid, pink of face, regal, and affable, and Roberto felt encouraged to confide all his sufferings. He told first of all about the paternal blasphemy. Was this sufficient reason to keep his father from reposing now in the bosom of the Father, to make him moan in hell? The confessor asked a few questions and led Roberto to admit that no matter when old Pozzo died, that event would most likely have occurred while he was taking the name of the Lord in vain. Cursing was a bad habit you pick up from the peasants, and the lords of the Monferrato countryside considered it a sign of superiority to speak, in the presence of their equals, with the words of their villains. You see, my son, the confessor concluded, your father died while he was performing one of those grand and noble acts through which a man is said to enter the paradise of heroes. Now, while I do not believe such a paradise exists, for I believe that in the kingdom of heaven both beggars and sovereigns, heroes and cowards live together in holy accord, surely our almighty king will not have denied his kingdom to your father only because his tongue slipped a bit at a moment when he had a great enterprise on his mind, and I would dare say that at such moments a similar ejaculation can even be a way of calling God as witness and judge of the great deed. If you are still tormented, pray for the soul of your parent and have some masses said for him, not so much to persuade the Lord to change his verdict, as he is not a vein that turns as the bigot's blow, but, rather, for the good of your own soul. Roberto told him then about the seditious talk of a friend to whom he had listened, and the priest opened his arms in a disconsolate gesture. My son, I know little of Paris, but from what I have heard I learn how many malefactors, climbers, abjurers, spies, intriguers exist in that new Sodom. And among them there are false witnesses, robbers of Ciboria, tramplers on crucifixes, and those who bribe beggars to make them deny God, and even people who in mockery have baptized dogs. And this is considered following the fashion of the time. In the churches they no longer say prayers, but stroll and laugh, wait in ambush behind columns to entrap ladies. There is constant noise even during the elevation. They claim to philosophize and they assail you with malicious whys. Why has God given laws to the world? Why is fornication prohibited? Why was the Son of God made flesh? And they distort your every reply to transform it into a proof of atheism. These are the fine wits of the time. Epicureans, Pyrrhonians, Diogeneans, and libertines. So you must not lend your ear to such seductions, which come from the evil one. As a rule Roberto does not abuse those capital letters in which the writers of his day excelled, but when he attributes sayings to Padre Emanuele, he employs many, as if the priest not only wrote but also spoke them, enforcing his words with special dignity, a sign that he was a man of great and attractive eloquence. And in fact, thanks to those words Roberto felt so relieved that, coming out of the confessional, he chose to linger a while with the older man. He learned that the priest was a Savoyard Jesuit and surely not a negligible figure, for he was resident in Casale as observer and envoy of the Duke of Savoy. A normal mission during a siege in those days. Padre Emanuele carried out his mission gladly. The gloomy siege afforded him opportunity to conduct in a leisurely way some studies that could not have tolerated the distractions of a capital city like Turin. And, questioned as to his occupation, he said that he, too, like the astronomers, was constructing a telescope. You must have heard some talk about that Florentine astronomer who used the telescope, or spyglass, that hyperbole of the eyes, to explain the universe, and how with the telescope he saw what the eyes had only imagined. I have great respect for this use of mechanical instruments to understand, as they say nowadays, the res extensa. But to understand the res cogitans, that is to say our way of knowing the world, we can use only another telescope, the same that Aristotle formerly used, and which is neither a tube nor a lens, but a weft of words, perspicacious idea, because it is only the gift of artful eloquence that allows us to understand this universe. Speaking thus, Padre Emanuele led Roberto out of the church and, strolling, they climbed up to the bastion, to a place that was calm that afternoon, as a muffled sound of cannon fire arrived from the opposite side of the city. They had before them the imperial encampments in the distance, but for a long stretch the fields were empty of troops and wagons, and the meadows and hills shone in the spring sun. "What do you see, my boy?" Padre Emanuele asked Roberto, who, still lacking eloquence, replied, "Fields." "To be sure, anyone can see fields down there. But you well know that, depending on the position of the sun, the color of the sky, the hour of the day and the season of the year, those fields can appear to you in varying guise and inspire different feelings. To the peasant, weary after his work, they appear as fields and nothing more. Similar is the case of the savage fisherman terrified by those nocturnal images of fire sometimes visible in the sky and frightening to behold. But as soon as the meteorists, who are also poets, dare call them crying comets, bearded and tailed, goats, beams, shields, torches and thunderbolts, these figures of speech clarify for you the clever symbols through which nature means to speak, as she uses these images as hieroglyphics, on the one hand referring to the signs of the zodiac and on the other to past events. And the fields? You see how much you can say of fields and how, as you speak, you see and comprehend more. Favonius blows, the earth opens, the nightingales weep, the leaf-crowned trees swagger, and you discover the wondrous genius of the fields in the variety of their strains of grasses nourished by the streams that play in happy puerility. The festive fields rejoice with jaunty merriment. At the appearance of the sun they open their countenance, and in them you observe the arc of a smile, and they celebrate the return of the star, intoxicated with the gentle austral kisses and laughter on the earth itself that expands in dumb happiness, and the matutinal warmth so fills them with joy that they shed tears of dew. Crowned with flowers, the fields submit to their genius and compose subtle hyperboles of rainbows. But their youth soon learns it must hasten to death, their laughter is troubled by a sudden pallor, the sky fades and lingering zephyr already sighs over a languishing earth, so that on the arrival of the winter heaven's first frowns, the fields sadden and reveal skeletons of frost. There, my son. If you had said simply that the fields are pretty, you would have done nothing but depict for me their greening, which I already know of, but if you say the fields laugh, you show me the earth is animate, and reciprocally I will learn to observe in human countenances all the refinements that I have perceived in the fields. And this is the office of the supreme figure of all, metaphor. If genius, and therefore learning, consists in connecting remote notions and finding similitude in things dissimilar, then metaphor, the most acute and far-fetched among tropes, is the only one capable of producing wonder, which gives birth to pleasure, as do changes of scene in the theater. And if the pleasure produced by figures derives from learning new things without effort and many things in small volume, then metaphor, setting our mind to flying betwixt one genus and another, allows us to discern in a single word more than one object. But one must know how to invent metaphors, which is not something for a rustic like me, who in all his life has seen fields only as the place for shooting at birds. You are a gentle man, and it will not be long before you become what in Paris they call an honest man, skilled in verbal joust as in that of the sword. And knowing how to conceive metaphors, and thus to see a world immensely more various than it appears to the uneducated, is an art that is learned. For, I must tell you, in this world where today all lose their minds over many and wondrous machines, some of which, alas, you can see also in this siege, I construct Aristotelian machines that allow anyone to see with words. For, I must tell you, in this